lived his life, right, according to the faith that he had. He lived his life by the trust that he had put into God. And so we're going to see that with some of these other heroes, that there's things that they hadn't seen with their eyes, right? But they had trust in God. They had faith in God. Um, any comments or questions on any of these things? Don't think that you're interrupting me. If you have a comment or a question, I appreciate comments and questions. I don't need to be the only one talking in class, and so I don't mind that at all. You're not going to break my train of thought. My track runs in 2-inch segments, anyways, so I can pick back up with where I was. But notice in verse 8 it says, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place which he would receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going." By faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. For he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So here we are introduced to Abraham, who obeyed God when he was told to leave his country. Abraham was from Ur of the Chaldees, which is the area where Babylon was going to be. And he was told that he was to leave there and he was to go to the land of Canaan, that God was going to give this land of Canaan to his descendants. And Abraham had never seen that land before. He didn't know where it was that he was going. He didn't have a GPS that he could argue with in the car, right? And they would have to continue reroute because you're running into traffic and you want to go a different way. He didn't have any of that, but he obeyed when he was called to go, even though he didn't know where it was that he was going. That goes back to things not seen, right? He had trust in God, even though he had never seen this land, to say, okay, I'm gonna go where it is that you're telling me to go. I'm gonna leave my family. Just imagine the amount of faith that would have taken to leave all of your folks behind and where it was that you were, to go someplace that's different. To go to some place that you didn't know what it was going to be like, that you had never seen before. But he trusted in that. So he didn't just believe God. Okay, God, I believe you're going to give this land to my descendants. He lived his life based on that being a fact, that he trusted in God that much that he lived by that faith. It says, by faith he dwelt, right, in the land of promise, the land that was promised to his descendants, as in a foreign country. So he recognized that, well, I'm not from here, right? I'm not from around here, but he dwelt in that land in tents, didn't have his own house to live in, right? He was a nomad, if you will. He was a pilgrim or sojourner. That's how the Bible will say that he looked at himself with regards to this time period. He dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. That promise that was given to Abraham, that the land was going to belong to his descendants, that promise was repeated. It was repeated to Isaac and it was repeated to Jacob. They were heirs of that same promise. Now, did Abraham ever receive the promised land for himself? No. Did Isaac ever receive it? Did Jacob ever receive it? No. See, it was promised to their descendants. They lived their lives as if that was true, but they didn't get to see the end of all of that. And the Hebrews writer will bring that up here in a little bit, that they lived their life according to that promise, even though they weren't able to see with their eyes what the end was going to be, right? They didn't get to realize that in their lifetime, but they saw it afar off, and they lived according to that. Why did they do that? Why did they trust in God? Well, because it says he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So he left his city, right, where his family was. He left there, and he went where God told him, because he's looking for another place. He's looking for a better place. The Old Testament doesn't say a lot about heaven, does it? We don't have a lot in there about, well, what did they understand about heaven? What did they understand about the afterlife? What did they know? He knew something, didn't he? Because he's looking for it. He's living his life because he's looking for the prize. He's looking for the reward that he's going to receive someday, right? And so he waited for the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So he's not looking for an earthly city. He's not saying, okay, well, I'm leaving Ur, I'm going to come over here. Maybe I'll settle in, Jerusalem, or maybe I'll settle in Jericho, or maybe I'll find some city over here in the plain and that'll be where I'll build my house. He's looking for a heavenly city. He's looking for a heavenly place. And so even though there's not a lot in the Old Testament about what they knew or what they understood, he had to have known something about the afterlife. He had to have known something about the reward that was to come, because he's waiting for the city that has foundations. And so he conducted himself based on the promises of God. That's what faith is. That's what trusting in God is. That, well, why do I have to be baptized in water? What does that dunking in water have to do with anything with getting my sins washed away? Because God said to do it, right? If we have faith in God, if we have trust in God, then we're going to do what it is that he says, even though we may not see with our eyeballs. Well, what difference does that make? It makes a difference to God because God has commanded it, right? Comments or questions on these things? Okay. You're a quiet group this morning. Maybe you stayed up too late watching the championship games or something. I went to bed early. So he waited for the city that has foundations, right? He's looking for a city. Um, he lived for the city. There's an old Stevie Wonder song about living for the city. He lived for that city in heaven, right? That's how he conducted his life, because he's looking for something else. Go back to chapter 10 for a moment. Chapter 10, and look at verse 34. In writing to these Hebrew Christians, the writer says, "You had compassion on me and my chains, joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven." So they were able to undergo persecution. They were able to undergo losing their earthly possessions, and they accepted that with joy. Why? Because they know they've got something better that's waiting for them, right? And so these folks that are facing persecution, they need to continue to hold on. Look at verse 36. You have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise, right? And so all through this, we're going to see that God makes a promise, and there's a reward that's going to come from that promise that God has made. And so the idea that we have a better and lasting possession is something that Abraham believed, that he had a better and a lasting possession, an enduring possession. And so he's looking for that city, looking for that New Jerusalem, looking for that heavenly city. And so he's living his life accordingly. So if we come back over to chapter 11, verses 11 and 12, by faith Sarah herself also received strength to conceive seed, and she bore a child when she was past the age, because she judged him faithful who had promised. Therefore from one man, and him as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude, innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. So here's Sarah. It says, by faith she received strength to conceive. Now, do you remember what happened when God told Abraham that he and Sarah were going to have a child? She laughed, right? She laughed. How old? Do you remember how old she was at that time? 90 years old, right? So she's 90 years old, and Abraham's 99, and it told, this time next year you're going to have a child, and she laughed. And God said, "What are you laughing? Is anything too hard for God Almighty?" And Sarah said, "I didn't laugh." And God says, "Yeah, you did. I heard you, right? You're not going to hide it from him. Not going to hide that from God." She laughed, but she had faith, because if Abraham and Sarah are going to have a child, something's going to have to happen, right? They can't just say, "Oh, I believe you, God. We're going to have a child," and then they don't do anything about it. There was something that needed to be done there, right? And so she received, 90-year-old woman received strength to be able to conceive, right? Because once your biological clock runs out, that typically doesn't happen anymore, right? But she received strength from God, and she and Abraham had to do something in order to conceive a child. And so that means that they had faith in what it was that God told them was going to happen, because she considered him who had promised faithful. And so go back to chapter 10 again. We kind of get an introduction to this in that summing up section that's there in chapter 10. In verse 23, the Hebrews writer talking to us says, "Let us hold fast," right, "the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And so we can remain faithful. We can hold on to our Christianity. We can hold fast to our faithfulness. Why? Because he who promised is faithful. Why did Sarah and Abraham get busy about conceiving a child? Well, because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. She put her trust in God and lived by that faith that she had in God. Even though with your eyeballs you say, "Oh, I'm 90 years old. There's no way I can conceive a child." Abraham, he's 90. He's as good as dead, right? One man as good as dead. We're going to have a child. With your eyeballs, you don't see how that's possible. But with faith in God, they lived their life according to the faith in God and judged him to be faithful who had promised. Therefore, by one man and him as good as dead were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude. Innumerable is the sand which is by the seashore. Now, that was the promise that was made to Abraham, wasn't it? There was a promise made back in Genesis chapter 15 that in his seed, all the nations of the earth were going to be blessed, but that they were going to become a great nation, that there were going to be many that were going to come from him, that his descendants were going to be as numerable as the stars and as numerable as the sand that's on the seashore. And in the time of Exodus, when Pharaoh, who didn't know Joseph, looks out and he sees all of these Israelites that had multiplied, there were 70, right, that had gone down into Egypt, but they had multiplied in Egypt. And so he sees, boy, there's a multitude of them now. There's a whole bunch of them. And when they come out of Egypt, there's like, was it 650,000 men? Just men, right? And you consider the women and the children, you're looking at probably somewhere in the neighborhood of 3 million people that are coming out. And there's going to be descendants beyond that, and descendants beyond that, and descendants beyond that. They're going to owe their lineage to Abraham, right? To this one man who was as good as dead when Isaac was born. And so it might have been hard for Abraham to believe. It might have been hard for Sarah to believe. She laughed at first, but ultimately they had faith in God, and they lived according to that faith. Believed even though they couldn't see it. And because of that, right, because of Abraham's faith, it's accredited to him for righteousness. Abraham's called the friend of God. He believed in God, and it was credited to him for righteousness. My righteous ones, right, my just ones shall live by faith. Yes, Mark?
Yeah. Also, Abraham and Sarah, Sarah in Hagar, her maidservant, that they got, they mistreated her. They didn't care. I mean, the whole the triangular relationship between all that fell apart. It was terrible. And to me, it just shows that you know Hebrews writer is giving credit by faith, not by what they do. But she worked to make bread for God and the visitors. Their neighborhood and begged them to stay with us a little while, rest, and then they got blessing, which she didn't believe. But all these things showed how they really failed in action. They tried to do things their way.
Well,
God did things a different way.
yeah, they tried to help God out, right? With the whole situation with Hagar, it's like, okay, we're going to have a child, or Abraham's going to have a child, so let's help him out but no, and God says, no, it's not going to be, because Ishmael was 13 years old, when Isaac was born, and so it's not going to be through that child. That's not going to be your heir. Your heir is going to come from you and Sarah, right? And so they had been told earlier they were going to have a child, but it hadn't happened yet, and so they're trying to run ahead of God, right? But ultimately, they had faith in God, right? And I think that's what the Hebrews writer is getting after. These people aren't perfect. None of them are perfect. And I think that's an evidence that we can take that the Bible's written by God. Because if it was written by man, how would the heroes be? We wouldn't see their warts, right? We wouldn't see their flaws. We wouldn't see their hindrances. We're going to notice something about that with regards to Lot in our sermon this morning. That even though folks are considered to be righteous, it doesn't mean that they're perfect. Being faithful isn't the same as being perfect. And so none of us are going to be perfect, but we are called to be faithful. And so while Abraham and Sarah weren't perfect in how they did all of that. They lived by their faith, and the Hebrews writer is God is testifying about them, right? And that's what the Hebrews writer is pointing out, that these heroes, because they lived by faith, God is still testifying about them. Um, Notice in verse 4 of chapter 11, where it talks about Abel offered a more excellent sacrifice, through which he obtained witness that he was righteous, God testifying of his gifts, and through it he being dead still speaks, right? God is still bearing witness, still testifying about these folks. In verse 2, by faith, the elders obtained a good testimony or a good witness, right? God is still testifying about the good things that these folks did, the faith that they had, and the belief that they had in God, and how they lived their lives according to that. And so he believed, and it was accredited to him for righteousness. And that's really what the Hebrews writer is getting after, is these righteous ones, right? They live by faith. My righteous one shall live by faith. And so they based their life on promises that they couldn't see. And so we think about, all right, what does this mean for us? Well, if God kept his promises to them, what he promised to them, then we can have faith that he's going to keep his promises to us. What has God promised to us? What's he going to do for us if we're faithful? Eternal life, right? A home in heaven. There's a reward, right? That he has promised for us for being faithful to him. And so, if we're going to live by those promises that God has made, if you do what it is that I say, right, then you can live in heaven. You can live in your promised land, just like Moses, right? If they did what Moses said, they could go into that physical promised land, which was kind of temporary. But if we do what God says, we get to go to a heavenly promised land, right? That's never going to go away. We're going to be there forever, right? If we're living by those promises, is that going to affect how we live? If we think about, God has promised us, but we've got to be faithful to him, does it affect the way that we live? Do we live differently than we would otherwise if we didn't understand that? Are we living for that city that Abraham was living for, that has foundations, that's built by God? Are we living for that? Are we living by faith? We might ask, are we giving by faith? Do we only give based on what we see with our eyeballs, only what it is that we have in our hands? Or do we have faith and trust in God in how we live our lives and how we give back to God? Over in Malachi chapter 3 and verse 10, God says, test me in this. Try me in this. See if I'll not open up the floodgates of heaven for you, right? To give the way that you are to give. And you got to, the Bible says that you reap according to what you sow, right? You reap according to what you sow. So when we think about our giving, are we like the farmer who says, boy, as soon as that bumper crop comes in, as soon as I get all of these goods, then I'm going to go out and sow some seed? You got to sow first, right? The farmer's got to sow first. He's got to sow the seed first, and then he reaps the harvest. Now, I'm not preaching a gospel of wealth and, prosperity, because God hasn't promised any of that to us. But God says if we do what's right, if we seek first his kingdom, right, and his righteousness, all these things are going to be added. We're going to have the things that we need for our life. And sometimes when we think, well, I got to cling to this and I can't let go of it, and we're only giving by what it is that we can see with our eyes. These folks couldn't see with their eyeballs how this was going to work out, and yet they lived their life according to it. They had faith in God. They believed in it. And so it wasn't just that they okay, I believe in what you say, God. It was that they lived by it, right? And when you do that, you do things that you wouldn't normally otherwise do, right? And we're gonna see that with regards to Abraham and Isaac. You do things that you wouldn't otherwise do, and that's when you get your reward, when you're living by faith, right? That's where the reward comes in. But you have to trust it enough to act upon it. They trusted it enough to act upon it. And from this one man and one woman who were as good as dead, were born as many as the stars of the sky in multitude. In verse 13, it says, these all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them afar off, were assured of them, embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. For those who say such things declare plainly that they seek a homeland. And truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. But now they desire a better, that is, a heavenly country. Therefore, God is not ashamed to be called their God, for he has prepared a city for them. So he says, these died in faith, not having received the promises. Well, what was it that Abraham was promised? That your descendants are going to be like the sand of the seashore. He didn't live long enough, right, to see that promise fulfilled, but he had trust in it and lived his life according to it. He was told that his descendants were going to inherit the land of Canaan, the land that flows with milk and honey, but not yet, because the iniquity of the Amorites was not complete yet. God wasn't going to kick them out yet. It's going to be several generations before he gives that to them. Well, did Abraham and Sarah see that? Did Isaac see that? Did Jacob? No, we talked about that. They didn't realize that, right? They didn't see that. They hadn't received the promises. They were far off, right? And your seed, Abraham, all the nations of the earth are going to be blessed. How was that going to happen? Through Christ, right? Through Jesus Christ, right? Remember what Jesus said, that Abraham longed to see his day? Right? Abraham wanted to see the things that had been promised to him. He wanted to see the end of what that was going to be. He had faith in God. He trusted in God, knew that it was afar off, right? And even though it was something that was afar off, he lived his life as if he was heading towards that. I don't know where you all are from or where you all have been. I grew up in northern Ohio, and they talk about how flat Ohio is, but we've got rolling hills and little things in Ohio. I've been through Indiana, and I thought Indiana was pretty flat until I got to the panhandle of Texas. When we drove across the panhandle of Texas, I mean, you could see something that's like 3 days away. And you're driving, and it seems like you're driving forever, and that thing's still sticking up out there. That to me seemed to be the flattest place on earth. But you see those things that are way off on the horizon, right? These things were way off on the horizon to Abraham and his immediate descendants. We're heading in that direction, but they weren't ever going to be the ones that were going to get there. It's going to be their descendants that are going to receive all of that. But they had a strong encouragement to live by faith, because God had made a promise to Abraham, and when he could swear by no one greater, he swore by himself. He swore an oath. And in Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 18, it says, by these two immutable things, the promise and the oath, these two unchangeable things, when God makes a promise, is he going to keep it? When God swears an oath, right? Oaths are for serious business in the Old Testament times. If God swears an oath, is he going to keep that? By these two immutable things, by these two unchangeable things, in which it's impossible for God to lie, we might have strong consolation, right? So we can base our hope, we can base our trust, we can have faith in God, because God has made a promise and God has sworn an oath, and he's not going to change his mind. He's going to keep his promise. He's going to keep his oath. And so you could take those things to the bank. That hope we have is an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, which enters the presence behind the veil, the Hebrews writer tells us over in chapter 6. Comments or questions on these things? Yes, sir.
I think with even with Hagar and Sarah, Abraham, the people at that time were in a physical world, and all they knew were physical things. When God talked about a city or something like that, they were looking for a physical place on earth, and I think they didn't understand that God was a spiritual being. And so I think when we read things like that, we need to realize that we know about the spiritual part of God. And we need to translate these into spiritual things.
Yeah.
Physical.
Yeah. It's easy for us being in the physical world to think of things in physical terms, right? And but no, there's a spiritual side to this, and that's what they were striving for, right? There's a spiritual belief.
Yeah.
And we've got more information than Abraham and Sarah ever had, right? Because we've got the completed Old Testament and New Testament that we can read through, and we can see all the things that God has done and all the promises that God has kept, and how God deals with mankind. And we can see that spiritual nature that we share with God, that is what's most important. So they saw them afar off. It says they were assured of them. Well, what assured them? Because God keeps his promises. She judged him who promised to be faithful, that he's one who keeps his promises, right? They embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth. And so they had left their homeland. They're just strangers and pilgrims. They're just passing through, right? This land. And so they're seeking a homeland that's not here. They're seeking a homeland that is elsewhere, right? Verse 14, those who say such things declare plainly they seek a homeland. And in verse 16, they desire a better, that is a heavenly country. All right, so they were looking for something that was better. They were looking for something that was heavenly. They were looking for something that was built by God and not built by man. And so they're seeking a homeland that's not here, right? And so sometimes we sing songs about that, right? I'm bound for the promised land. Now, we might have a VBS theme or something that goes along with that, where we're talking about how the Israelites, captured the land of Canaan and they were bound for the promised land and they were going into but we're bound for the promised land of heaven, right? We're in that group, right? If we're living by faith, there's another song we could sing, right? Living by faith in Jesus above. This world is not my home, right? I'm just a passing through. My treasures are laid up somewhere beyond the blue. And so there's, I don't know if the Hebrews writer had any of these songs in mind when he wrote these things, but we have songs that we sing that kind of remind me of all the things that he's talking about here. That's how we're to be, and looking forward to that, right? Taking that long view and looking forward to heaven and living our life by that. Recognizing that we're strangers here on the earth, that this isn't our permanent home, that we're just passing through. And so these folks had a right view of eternity. In verse 15, he says, and truly, if they had called to mind that country from which they had come out, they would have had opportunity to return. The country from which they came out of. Well, if he's writing to Hebrew Christians about a country that they had come out of, what do you think most of them are going to think about? Egypt, right? So there's an obvious parallel here with Egypt. And just as they had come out of Egypt, right, how they had come out of a foreign country to go somewhere else, it's kind of symbolic, representing them having come out of Judaism, right? These are Hebrew Christians. These are Jews who had been practicing Judaism. They had come out of that country, right? They'd come out of Judaism and into Christianity, and they need to stick with it because Jesus is better. We've been seeing that all through the book of Hebrews, that Jesus is better. And because Jesus is better, hold fast to your confidence. Hold fast to your confession. Hold fast to your Christianity and remain faithful to Christ, because what you have is better in Christianity than what you had in Judaism, right? And so there's a country, there's a thing that they have come out of because they desire a better country. They desire a heavenly country. They desire, and everything that we have in Christ is better than what they had in Judaism. We've spent a lot of time talking about that. If you're visiting today and you want to see some of that, the videos are available on our YouTube channel. I think we started the book of Hebrews somewhere around February or March of this year. We may finish it in a year. Yeah. But you got something better, right? So Abraham left his country, right? He left where he went someplace he had never seen before. They left Egypt to go someplace that they hadn't been before, right? And so they're coming to a different place. And so they need to leave that behind and not look behind them. Now, one of the things that God got angry about was that when they came out of Egypt and they received the law, and they had been complaining and they had been rebelling against God, but they finally get up to the area of Kadesh Barnea and they send the spies out into the land, right? The 12 spies go out and they spy the land out. When they come back, what happens?
10 said no, 2 said okay.
Yeah, 10 of them said, we can't do this, right? They're too strong. The cities are fortified. There's giants in the land, right? The land devours its people. There's no way that we can take this. But Joshua and Caleb said, no, we can do this. But the crowd, right? The majority of people, they went with the report of the 10 spies, and they cried and lamented that God has brought us out here and now we're going to be killed, right? And so they didn't want Moses' leadership anymore. They didn't want Aaron, his brother, they didn't want his leadership anymore either. And they were prepared to stone Moses and Aaron, elect a new leader, and go back to Egypt. I think about what a slap in the face that is to God, who, through all of those miracles, right, all of those plagues upon Egypt, had brought them out with a mighty hand, had shown him all the mighty things that he could do, had provided manna for them, had provided water for them. And now, well, we just want to go back to Egypt, God. When they were crying in Egypt for God to deliver them at the beginning of that whole story, right? If they thought about the country that they had come out of, they'd have an opportunity to return. They were thinking about going back to Egypt, right? They'd rather have the devil that they know than what's unknown. And sometimes we can fall into that trap too. We get caught in something and we'd rather deal with the evil that we know rather than what's unknown. But he says if they had called it, don't look behind, right? When you come into Christianity, when you leave Judaism and come to Christianity, don't be looking back at the country that you came out of and saying, boy, you know, if we just went back over there, we wouldn't have to deal with this little bit of persecution that we're facing. Because Hebrews writer is getting ready to deal with that with regards to Moses. Moses could have lived in Pharaoh's household and not been persecuted, but instead he's going to choose affliction with the people of God, right? It's going to change his life and what it is that he's going to do, be it based on the faith that he has in God. And so don't go back, right? Don't shrink back. Remember the Habakkuk passage, right? God's soul has no pleasure in those who shrink back, those who fall away. So don't shrink back. Don't go back. Don't turn back into what is behind, but continue to press on ahead. And so Abraham went to a land he'd never seen before, left it based on faith in God's promises. He's looking for that new city. He's looking for that new Jerusalem. Look over at chapter 12 and verse 22 real quick. It's talking about we haven't come to a physical place. We've come to a spiritual place. And in verse 22, you've come to Mount Zion, to the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem, to an innumerable company of angels. And so it talks about a heavenly Jerusalem. And then in chapter 13 and verse 14, for here we have no continuing city, but we seek the one to come. We don't have any city here that continues forever and forever and forever, but we seek the one that's in heaven. We seek the one that is to come. And so Jesus talks about, don't turn back when you put your hand to the plow, right? Don't look behind you. When you put your hand to the plow, you gotta pay attention to what you're doing. Your rows aren't going to be straight if you're looking behind you and you're trying to plow your field, right? You put your hand to the plow, you gotta look forward. You gotta keep pressing on. And so maybe you're here today and you came out of some country. Maybe you weren't raised in the church. I wasn't raised in the church. I came out of the denominational group, right? Don't look back. What's behind you. Don't leave what you have that's better to go back to something that's behind you. You got to look forward to something that's better. I usually use the Cleveland Browns as an example for this. If I was a player for the Cleveland Browns and I got traded to the Kansas City Chiefs, or I guess this year the Detroit Lions, why would I want to go back to Cleveland? Right? Why would I want to leave something that's better to go back to something that's inferior? If we've got something better with Christianity, why would we want to go back to something that's inferior? Why would they want to go back to Judaism? God's prepared a city, right? God's prepared a place for us. Didn't Jesus say that? I go to prepare a place for you, and if I prepare a place, I'm going to come back and you're going to be where I am, right? We can't see that city with our eyeballs, can we? How many of us have ever seen heaven with our eyeballs? No. But we live our lives according to that promise because we have trust in God and we have faith in God. So we strive for it by faith. Any comments or questions through verse 16? In verse 17, by faith, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, and he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son, of whom it was said, in Isaac your seed shall be called, concluding that God was able to raise him up even from the dead, from which he also received him in a figurative sense. So here's Abraham. Abraham's told, no, that the heir in your house is not going to be Eleazar. It's not going to be the servant that's born in your house. It's not going to be Ishmael, who was born to Hagar, right? And Abraham was his father. Not going to be him. It's going to be the son of promise is going to come from you and Sarah, right? He's going to be, and it refers to him here as his only begotten son, right? That Isaac is the one. And so God told him that all the promises that I've given to you depend upon Isaac. Now I want you to go and sacrifice Isaac. Imagine the conflict that would create in your mind to say, wait a minute. All the promises are based on Isaac. Now you want me to sacrifice Isaac? But this says nothing about it in the book of Genesis. It says nothing about this in the Old Testament. But here the Hebrews writer tells us, here's what's going on in Abraham's mind. Abraham is saying, okay, God, all the promises that you're giving me are going to go through Isaac. But you're telling me to sacrifice Isaac. Therefore, God must have a way of raising Isaac back up from the dead after I've sacrificed him. And he lived according to that, didn't he? Did Abraham go and do what it is that God told him? He and the lad went off, right, to go do that until God stopped him. He lived his life according to that faith that he had in God because he trusted in God. Even though he had never seen anybody raised from the dead with his eyeballs, he concluded that God was going to be able to do that. How much faith do you think that would have taken? It would have taken a lot of faith, wouldn't it? I mean, all the promises are going to come through this son. They're all going to come through Isaac. When we're tested, right? When there's a conflict, when there's tension, when there's two competing things, that's when we find out what kind of faith we have. That's when faith is proven or faith is showed. He's got these conflicting things in his mind that, okay, all the promises are coming through Isaac, but you want me to go and sacrifice. And if I'm going to be faithful to you, I got to do what you say and go sacrifice Isaac. But all the promises are going to come through Isaac. And so the promise told him everything was dependent on the nation that was going to come from Isaac. And it says here that in verse 17, in the New King James, it says, he who had received the promises offered up his only begotten son. So Isaac here is referred to as Abraham's only begotten son. Is Isaac Abraham's only son? Ishmael, right, with Hagar. So he's not his only son, but here it says he's his only begotten son. The word that's translated begotten there is an interesting word. It's the same word that's used for Jesus. When we read John chapter 3 and verse 16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. It's the same Greek word that is there, and the Greek word there means only one of his kind. Doesn't necessarily mean begotten. It's translated begotten, and it's been translated that way since the King James version of 1611. But the word really means one and only, unique, only one of his kind. Isaac is not Abraham's only son. He's the only one of his kind. He's the only one that the promise is going to go through. The promise isn't going to go through Ishmael. The promise is going to go through Isaac. He's the only one of his kind. Jesus is the only one of his kind. There's no one who's like Jesus, right? He's unique. He's one and only as part of the Godhead. And so you kind of see this parallel here between Abraham, who's willing to sacrifice his one and only unique son, that the promise comes through, and God sacrificing his one and only unique son, who the promise comes through to us. It's pretty powerful stuff when you see the kind of faith that these folks had, not just that they believed God, but they lived according to that faith. They put their money where their mouth was. And I think they're good examples for us because we ought to look to build our faith, that we have the same kind of faith like they did. That we're willing to do what it is. God hasn't asked us to sacrifice our only son, right? God hasn't asked us to do any of those things, but God has asked us to live apart from the world, to not love the world and the things that are in it, to seek him first, right? He's given us some things to do, and if we're going to have faith in him, we need to live by that. Any last minute comments, questions, or snide remarks? All right. If not, we'll break for worship. Thank you.